The German checkpoint guard couldn't believe his eyes. Through the morning mist of rural France emerged something that defied all logic, a British officer in full Highland dress uniform, complete with swaying Cameron tartan kilt and distinctive feathered bonnet, walking casually down a dusty country road as if he were strolling through the Scottish Highlands. The morning sun caught the polished brass of his uniform buttons, and his military bearing was unmistakable. But what happened next would change everything. The guard's hand instinctively reached for his Mauser rifle, then froze mid-motion. This wasn't just any British officer. This was someone who had already become a living nightmare among German forces, someone they whispered about in nervous tones around their campfires, someone they called Der Schottische Morder im Rock. The Kilted Killer. And there was a very specific reason why Nazi High Command had just placed the largest bounty in all of occupied France on his head. The stories about this man had spread through the Wehrmacht like wildfire. They said he could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish like Highland mist. They said he drove through German territory in broad daylight, flying enemy flags as if he were inspecting his own troops. They said he had single-handedly turned southern France into a graveyard for German ambitions. But to understand why Tommy McPherson became the most hunted man in Nazi-occupied Europe, you need to know what happened in that aircraft 3 nights earlier, June 8, 1944. The converted RAF Halifax bomber droned through the darkness at 8,000 feet, its engines creating a steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to countless covert operations across occupied Europe. Inside the cramped fuselage, 3 men prepared for what most military strategists would consider either a suicide mission or an act of complete madness. Major Ronald Thomas Stewart McPherson, Tommy to those who knew him well, sat methodically checking his equipment for the 3rd time in an hour. His movements were precise, practiced, but there was something different about this particular mission. Instead of the standard dark clothing and camouflage gear favored by special operations, Tommy wore the full dress uniform of the Cameron Highlanders, the distinctive tartan kilt, the military jacket with its gleaming buttons, the feathered bonnet that marked him as an officer of one of Scotland's most prestigious regiments. "Ready, sir?" asked Sergeant Arthur Brown, the radio operator whose steady hands and unflappable demeanor would mean the difference between successful coordination with Allied forces and complete communications blackout behind enemy lines. Brown had served with Tommy on 2 previous operations, and he'd learned to trust the Major's unconventional methods, even when they seemed to border on the insane. Tommy nodded, his attention focused on the 3rd member of their team, Lieutenant Michel de Bourbon, a French officer whose intimate knowledge of local resistance networks, German patrol patterns, and the political complexities of occupied France would either save their lives or get them all killed before dawn. Michel had been living this war longer than either of his British colleagues, and the weight of that experience showed in the lines around his eyes. The mission parameters were simple in concept, terrifying in execution. They were part of Operation Jedburgh, elite 3-man teams parachuted behind enemy lines to coordinate with local resistance forces. Their specific objective: create such widespread chaos and destruction throughout southern France that German forces would be unable to effectively respond to the massive Allied invasion that had begun at Normandy just 2 days earlier. But Tommy McPherson had developed his own interpretation of the mission briefing. Plans that went far beyond standard sabotage operations. Plans that would either make him a legendary figure in the annals of psychological warfare or get him executed as a spy before he had a chance to prove their effectiveness. The red light came on in the aircraft's cabin, bathing everything in an ominous crimson glow. Jump time was approaching. "Remember," Tommy shouted over the increasing engine noise as the pilot reduced altitude, "we're not here to hide in the shadows like common saboteurs. We're here to make the Germans afraid of their own shadows, to question every assumption they've made about this war." What he didn't tell his team was the real reason he'd insisted on wearing his full Highland uniform for the jump. It wasn't just about making a statement or maintaining military tradition in hostile territory. It was about creating a psychological weapon more powerful than any explosive or firearm. The parachute jump into occupied France should have been routine. 3 men, minimal equipment, quick link up with resistance forces, then disappear into the countryside to begin operations. Instead, it became the opening act of a legend that would terrorize German forces for months to come. Tommy hit the ground hard in a moonlit field outside Aurillac, the impact sending a shock through his knees that reminded him why paratroopers were considered slightly mad by the rest of the military. His Highland uniform, sodden with morning dew, created a bizarre silhouette in the pre-dawn darkness, the distinctive shape of his kilt swirling around his legs like some ancient Celtic warrior stepping out of Highland mist into the modern nightmare of occupied Europe. As he gathered his silk parachute, working quickly to bundle the evidence of his arrival, Tommy heard voices approaching through the darkness, French voices, urgent and confused, speaking in the rapid patois of the Auvergne region. The resistance cell that was supposed to meet them had obviously heard the aircraft pass overhead and was moving to the predetermined landing zone. Chef, one of the resistance fighters called to his leader, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and bewilderment. ILYA un officier français ICI, ETIL mean SA femme. There's a French officer here, and he's brought his wife. The mistake was completely understandable. In the uncertain light of a quarter moon, with his distinctive Highland kilt creating an unfamiliar silhouette, Tommy had been mistaken for a woman accompanying a French officer. But instead of being embarrassed or concerned about operational security, he found himself smiling. This was exactly the kind of psychological effect he had been hoping to achieve: confusion, uncertainty, the disruption of enemy expectations, when Bernard Cornell, leader of the local resistance cell and a man whose weathered face spoke of years spent fighting a war in the shadows, finally saw Tommy clearly in the growing daylight. His jaw literally dropped. Here, standing in a French meadow surrounded by the detritus of a covert parachute operation, was a British officer in full Highland dress uniform, looking for all the world as if he were about to inspect a parade in Edinburgh rather than begin guerrilla operations in Nazi-occupied territory. Mon Dieu! Bernard whispered, his eyes taking in every detail of Tommy's appearance, from the Cameron tartan kilt to the distinctive military insignia. You are serious about this uniform? Completely serious, Tommy replied in accent-perfect French, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from absolute confidence in one's mission. You see, when a British officer parachutes into a resistance situation, his only real authority is his own personality and the respect he can command from the men he's asking to risk their lives. I intend to reinforce that authority with a little theatrical psychology. Bernard's expression shifted from bewilderment to something approaching understanding, though he clearly still had reservations about this unconventional approach to clandestine warfare. But theater, as Tommy knew, was just the beginning. What he did next would send shockwaves through German command structures and establish his reputation as the most dangerous individual in occupied France. June 9, 1944. Dawn was breaking over the French countryside, painting the rolling hills of the Auvergne in shades of gold and green, when Tommy McPherson made his first crucial decision as a Jedburgh operative. It was the kind of decision that would either establish his authority among the hardened resistance fighters gathered around Bernard's kitchen table, or get them all killed before the sun reached its zenith. The safe house was a modest stone farmhouse that had belonged to Bernard's family for 3 generations. Its thick walls and isolated location made it perfect for clandestine meetings, but Tommy could see the tension in the faces of the assembled resistance fighters. These were men and women who had been fighting a shadow war for years, who had learned through bitter experience that hasty decisions led to shallow graves. We attack tonight, Tommy announced without preamble, spreading a detailed map of the local area across the scarred wooden table. Bernard Cornell nearly choked on his morning coffee, a bitter chicory substitute that was all they could obtain under German rationing. Pardon. Tonight. But Major, you have been on French soil for exactly 8 hours. You don't know the local terrain, you don't know German patrol patterns, you don't know which of our neighbors might be collaborators. I know enough, Tommy interrupted, his finger tracing the railway line that carried German supplies through their operational area. This railway bridge on the Aurillac-Mours line. Tell me about its defenses. Claude Martineau, Bernard's second-in-command, and a former railway worker who knew every kilometer of track in the region, leaned forward reluctantly. 2 sentries, usually. Wehrmacht regulars, not SS. Sometimes 4 during shift changes. But Monsieur le Major, this is not wise. Successful resistance operations require weeks of preparation, careful observation, detailed planning, while we're conducting our careful observations and detailed planning," Tommy said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from absolute conviction. "German reinforcements are moving toward Normandy with every passing hour. Every moment we spend in reconnaissance is another hour for the Wehrmacht to reorganize their defenses, to reinforce their coastal positions, to bring up the reserves that could turn the Allied invasion into a disaster." His finger tapped the bridge location on the map. "This bridge carries German supply trains, ammunition, fuel, reinforcements. We destroy it tonight, and we disrupt their logistics for at least 48 hours. More importantly, we announce to every German commander in southern France that nowhere is safe, that the British are here, and that the rules of this war have just changed." The resistance fighters exchanged uncertain glances. Marie-Claire Dubois, one of only 2 women in the cell and someone who had lost her husband to a German execution squad 6 months earlier, spoke up. "With respect, Major, this British officer in his strange Scottish uniform is asking us to risk everything we've built, all our networks and safe houses, on an operation planned in minutes rather than weeks." Tommy met her gaze directly, recognizing the grief and determination in her eyes. "Madame Dubois, I'm asking you to risk everything because that's exactly what your country needs right now." The time for caution ended when the Allies landed at Normandy. Now is the time for audacity. It was Lieutenant Michel de Bourbon who finally broke the tension. His voice carried the weight of someone who had been fighting this war from the beginning, who understood both its costs and its necessities. "He's right. If we're going to make a difference, if we're going to justify the risks we're taking, we have to move fast and hit hard. The Germans expect resistance groups to be careful, methodical, predictable. They don't expect us to attack within hours of arrival." That night, as German supply trains rolled through the French darkness carrying ammunition and reinforcements toward the embattled Normandy beaches, they encountered something that no Wehrmacht logistics officer had prepared for in their contingency planning. The explosion that lit up the French countryside at 2:47 a.m. was visible for miles in every direction, a brilliant orange fireball that turned night into temporary day and sent shockwaves through every German garrison within 50 kilometers. Tommy and his resistance fighters had spent 4 hours carefully placing enough plastic explosive under the Aurillac-Mors railway bridge to not just destroy the structure, but to send an unmistakable message that would reach German high command within hours. The bridge itself was a marvel of 19th century engineering, a stone and steel structure that had carried trains across the ravine for over 60 years. It had been built to last centuries, designed to withstand the worst weather the Auvergne region could produce. But it had never been designed to withstand the focused attention of British explosives experts and French resistance fighters who understood exactly where to place their charges for maximum destruction. As the bridge collapsed into the ravine below in a cascade of twisted steel and shattered stone, Tommy watched from his concealed position in the treeline with cold professional satisfaction. The sound of the collapse echoed off the surrounding hills like thunder, a rolling acoustic signature that would wake every German soldier for miles around and send them scrambling for their weapons and radios. "Magnifique," Bernard whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror at what they had just accomplished. "But now they'll hunt us with everything they have. Every available patrol, every informant, every collaborator will be looking for us." "Good," Tommy replied, his eyes never leaving the destruction they had wrought. "I want them hunting us. I want them afraid to move without looking over their shoulders. The more resources they dedicate to finding us, the fewer they have available for fighting the Allied invasion. Fear is a weapon, Bernard, and tonight we've just announced that the weapon is loaded and aimed at anyone wearing a German uniform." What Bernard couldn't possibly know was that Tommy had already planned their next 6 operations while the plastic explosive was being prepared. Not the careful, methodical sabotage campaigns that resistance groups usually attempted, operations designed to minimize risk and maximize the survival of the cell. Instead, Tommy was planning a campaign of psychological warfare designed to make the Germans question every assumption they had made about the nature of resistance in occupied France. The immediate German response arrived exactly 37 minutes after the explosion, just as Tommy had predicted. Wehrmacht trucks raced along the roads leading to the bridge site, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. But by then, Tommy's team had already melted back into the countryside, following escape routes that Bernard's people had prepared months earlier for exactly this kind of situation. As they made their way back to the safe house through the pre-dawn darkness, Tommy was already calculating the psychological impact of their night's work. The destruction of the bridge would delay German supply trains for at least 48 hours. But more importantly, it would force every German commander in the region to reassess their security assumptions. They would have to increase patrols, establish new checkpoints, divert resources from frontline operations to guard their rear areas. The next morning brought exactly the response Tommy had hoped for, though it also brought dangers that would test every aspect of their operational security. Dawn, June 10th. The Wehrmacht's response was swift and brutal. An entire SS company swept through the area, conducting house-to-house searches, but they weren't looking for a British officer in Highland dress. They expected typical resistance fighters, French civilians with hidden weapons and nervous expressions. Tommy walked right past their checkpoint wearing his full Highland uniform, complete with feathered bonnet. To the German guards, he was such an obvious impossibility that their minds simply didn't process what they were seeing. "That was insane," Michel whispered when they'd cleared the checkpoint. "No," Tommy corrected, "that was psychology. They expect resistance fighters to hide. They expect British agents to blend in. They don't expect someone to advertise his presence with a kilt." But what Tommy learned that morning would change everything about their mission. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the messenger reported breathlessly, his face flushed from the desperate bicycle ride he had made through German patrolled territory to bring this intelligence. "They're moving north through Figeac, heading directly for the Normandy coast. Full combat strength. Panzer IVs, Tigers, self-propelled artillery, mechanized infantry, everything. They left their garrison 3 hours ago." Tommy studied his detailed map of southern France with growing urgency, his mind racing through tactical possibilities and strategic implications. Das Reich was one of Germany's most elite armored units, a formation with a reputation for both military effectiveness and unspeakable brutality towards civilian populations. They had participated in some of the worst atrocities on the Eastern Front, and their transfer to France had been a clear indication that German high command was preparing for exactly the kind of Allied invasion that had just begun at Normandy. But more than their reputation, it was their combat capability that made Tommy's blood run cold. Das Reich represented approximately 15,000 of Germany's most experienced soldiers, equipped with the finest tanks and artillery the Wehrmacht could provide. If they reached the Normandy beachheads intact and fully operational, they could smash through Allied positions like a steel sledgehammer, potentially driving the invasion forces back into the sea and turning D-Day from a triumph into a catastrophic defeat. "How long before they reach the coast?" Tommy asked, his finger tracing the route the division would have to take through the winding roads of central France. At their current speed, accounting for the size of the column and the condition of the roads, Michel calculated quickly, his knowledge of French geography proving invaluable, 36 hours maximum. Possibly less if they pushed through the night without stopping for rest. Tommy's mind raced through the mathematical realities of their situation. A 3-man Jedburgh team, even supported by several hundred local resistance fighters, couldn't possibly stop an entire SS Panzer division in direct combat. The disparity in numbers, equipment, and firepower was so enormous that any frontal confrontation would result in their complete annihilation within minutes, but they might be able to slow the division down. And in a war where hours could determine the outcome of entire campaigns, slowing down 15,000 German soldiers for even a day could be worth more than a conventional victory. "We're going to set a trap," Tommy announced, his voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that inspired confidence even in the most desperate situations. Bernard looked skeptical, his weathered face creased with concern. "For an entire panzer division? With what? We have perhaps 300 fighters in this entire region, most armed with nothing more than rifles and homemade explosives. They have tanks, artillery, professional soldiers who have been fighting this war for 5 years." Tommy's smile was grim, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of a plan already forming. "We're not going to fight them, Bernard. We're going to use their own expectations against them. They expect the French roads to be safe for German military traffic. They expect resistance forces to avoid contact with major Wehrmacht formations. They don't expect a coordinated ambush designed not to destroy them, but to delay them long enough for Allied forces to consolidate their beachheads. What Tommy planned next would become a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, a demonstration of how small forces with superior intelligence and tactical creativity could influence battles far beyond their apparent capabilities. The road from Figeac stretched through dense forest, perfect for Tommy's operation. He and his fighters worked through the night, placing explosives not just on the road, but in trees above it. The plan was elegant. The first explosion would disable the lead vehicle, blocking the convoy. Subsequent explosions would bring down trees, creating obstacles taking hours to clear, but Tommy's real genius was positioning himself where German commanders could see him. Not hiding, but standing in full Highland dress beside the road like reviewing a parade. The lead Panzer IV stopped so suddenly the vehicle behind nearly collided. Through binoculars, the German commander saw something impossible: a British officer in formal Highland uniform, apparently unarmed, standing casually beside a French country road. "Is that?" the commander began. The explosion answered his question. Tommy's charges went off in sequence, blocking the road with twisted metal and fallen trees. More importantly, they sent a message: nowhere in occupied France was safe from the British. The Das Reich division spent 14 precious hours clearing that single ambush site. 14 hours that might have changed Normandy's outcome, but Tommy McPherson was just getting started. Word of the Highland officer spread through German forces like wildfire. Radio intercepts spoke of ein schottischer Offizier causing havoc. Intelligence reports described someone operating with supernatural boldness. Tommy encouraged the legends deliberately. He ensured German patrols caught glimpses of his distinctive uniform. He left Highland Regiment insignia at sabotage sites. He had Bernard's men spread stories in local cafes about the mad Scotsman who could appear anywhere. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers began seeing Highland uniforms in every shadow. Patrol reports described kilted figures that vanished when pursued. The mythology grew with each telling, but mythology wasn't enough. Tommy needed to escalate. 3 weeks after landing, Tommy had transformed from a single British agent into something far more dangerous, a symbol of British determination the Germans couldn't ignore. His network had grown from Bernard's small cell to over 300 fighters spread across southern France. His tactics had evolved from simple sabotage to sophisticated psychological warfare. The railway campaign was the masterpiece. Instead of randomly destroying tracks, Tommy's teams coordinated attacks to create maximum confusion. They would hit 3 different lines simultaneously, forcing German command to assume they faced a much larger force. German forces had to spread resources thin, guarding every bridge, junction, supply depot. Thousands of soldiers who should have been fighting the Allies were instead hunting for a Scottish phantom who seemed everywhere and nowhere. But the operation that truly established the Kilted Killer legend was the Cahors Railway blockade, July 1, 1944. Tommy's most audacious operation began with simple observation: Germans moved heaviest supplies by rail. Cut the rail lines, and you crippled their logistics. The plan required split-second coordination across 50 miles. Tommy's teams would simultaneously destroy bridges, block tunnels, and sabotage switching equipment along the entire Cahors-Soulac rail line. "If we do this right," Tommy explained, "we don't just stop one train. We stop all rail traffic in southern France for at least a week." The operation began at midnight. Across the region, explosive charges detonated in perfect sequence. Bridges collapsed. Tunnels filled with rubble. Railway switches locked. By dawn, the Cahors-Soulac line was completely severed. But Tommy's masterstroke came 12 hours later. As German engineers worked frantically to repair damage, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. At every sabotage site, someone had left the same calling card, a small Scottish flag with a note in German. "The Kilted Killer sends his regards. He'll be back." German High Command's response was swift and desperate. Intelligence officers compiled detailed profiles. Rewards were offered. Captured resistance fighters were interrogated specifically about the Highland officer. But Tommy stayed ahead by doing the opposite of what any sane agent would do. Instead of hiding, he became more visible. Instead of avoiding German forces, he drove directly past their checkpoints. The black Citroën was his masterstroke. August 1944. Tommy acquired the vehicle through resistance contacts, a gleaming black Citroën traction Avant that had belonged to a German administrative officer who had been foolish enough to travel unescorted through resistance-controlled territory. But instead of using it for covert transportation or selling it for funds, Tommy transformed it into something far more valuable, a mobile instrument of psychological warfare. The car itself was a masterpiece of French engineering, sleek and powerful enough to outrun most German patrol vehicles if necessary. But Tommy's modifications turned it into something unprecedented in the annals of clandestine operations. Working with Jean-Baptiste, a former automotive mechanic who had joined the resistance after his workshop was commandeered by the Germans, Tommy had special flag mounts welded to the vehicle's front fenders. On one side flew the Union Jack, its red, white, and blue colors bright and unmistakable even from a distance. On the other side, equally prominent, flew the Cross of Lorraine, the symbol of Free France and de Gaulle's movement, a sight that filled French civilians with hope and German soldiers with dread. And behind the wheel, clearly visible to anyone who cared to look, sat a British officer in full Highland dress, his uniform immaculate, his bearing absolutely fearless. The psychological effect was beyond anything Tommy had dared hope for. Here was a vehicle that announced the presence of Allied forces in the most brazen manner possible, driving through German-occupied territory in broad daylight as if conducting a royal inspection tour. The sight was so unprecedented, so audacious, that German soldiers at checkpoints would see it approaching and simply freeze, their minds unable to process what they were witnessing. Klaus Weber, a Wehrmacht sergeant who later described the experience during Allied interrogation, captured the German reaction perfectly. It was impossible. No agent would be so careless with security, so deliberately conspicuous. Either this man was completely insane, or he was so confident in his abilities and his protection that he didn't fear capture. The second possibility was far more terrifying than the first. Intelligence reports began flooding German headquarters throughout southern France. Black Citroën with enemy flags observed passing checkpoint 7 at 1,400 hours. No attempt to stop or inspect. British officer in Scottish uniform seen driving through Aurillac city centre at midday. Vehicle flying Union Jack and Gaullist symbols. Suspect escaped when patrol attempted pursuit. Both assessments were partly correct. Tommy was taking calculated risks that bordered on madness, driving his flag-draped vehicle through enemy territory with an audacity that defied all conventional wisdom about clandestine operations. But he understood something about human psychology that his enemies didn't. The more visible and confident he became, the more legendary he seemed to both friend and foe. And legends, Tommy knew from his study of military history, are much harder to kill than mere men. The Black Citroën tours became the stuff of French folklore almost immediately. Villages would buzz with excitement for days after sightings. Le tour cassais était ici. Il a conduit directement devant la garnison allemande. The Scottish killer was here. He drove right past the German garrison. Children would run alongside the roads hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous Highland officer, while German patrols would race to intercept reports of the vehicle, only to find empty roads and laughing French civilians. But Tommy's boldest operation with the Citroën was yet to come, and it would demonstrate just how thoroughly his psychological warfare campaign had penetrated German military thinking, the trap that couldn't be sprung mid-August 1944. German intelligence had figured out Tommy's pattern. The Highland officer favored a particular route connecting several resistance safe houses. They set the perfect trap. Wehrmacht soldiers, concealed positions, clear fields of fire. When the Black Citroën appeared, they would finally have their prize. Tommy saw the ambush from a mile away. The positioning was textbook, professional, lethal. Any normal person would have turned around. Tommy drove straight into it. As his Citroën approached the kill zone, German soldiers tensed on their weapons. Through binoculars, they could see him clearly: Highland uniform, feathered bonnet, driving with casual confidence. At the last moment, Tommy stopped the car. He got out, stood beside the vehicle, and appeared to consult a map. For 30 seconds, he presented a perfect target to dozens of German marksmen. None of them fired. Later, when German command demanded to know why, the soldier's explanation was revealing. He was so calm, so confident, we thought it must be a trap. We thought he had support we couldn't see. Tommy's psychological warfare had worked perfectly. His boldness had created doubt, and doubt had saved his life, but the Germans were learning too. And their next move would force Tommy to escalate beyond anything he'd attempted: the 300,000 franc bounty. September 15, 1944. The poster appeared on walls throughout occupied France overnight. Printed in German, French, and broken English. Wanted, dead or alive. Scottish officer in Highland uniform. Extremely dangerous terrorist. Reward: 300,000 francs. Below was a detailed description: approximately 6 feet tall, dark hair, wears traditional Scottish military dress including kilt and feathered hat. Operates with French resistance terrorists. Approaches in black Citroën flying British and French flags. The bounty was staggering, more money than most French workers saw in 5 years. It was also an admission of desperation. The German war machine, which had conquered most of Europe, was now offering a fortune for one British officer in a kilt. Tommy's reaction was characteristic. He laughed. 300,000 francs, he mused to Bernard. I'm flattered. Though I think my kilt alone is worth at least 400,000. But beneath the humor, Tommy understood the implications. The bounty would make every collaboration dangerous. French civilians who might have ignored him before would now see 300,000 reasons to turn him in. It was time for the most audacious operation of his career, the taunting of the Wehrmacht. Instead of going underground after the bounty was posted, Tommy did something that stunned even his own resistance fighters. He increased his public appearances. The same week the posters went up, Tommy drove his flag-flying Citroën through the center of Aurillac at noon, when streets were crowded with German soldiers and French civilians. He stopped at a cafe, ordered coffee, and sat at an outdoor table for 30 minutes. Clearly visible, German soldiers watched from across the street, hands on weapons, but no one approached. The Scottish officer's confidence was so absolute that they assumed he must have superior firepower hidden nearby. He didn't. Tommy was alone except for his sidearm, betting his life on the psychology of the absurd. You're insane, Michel told him that evening. You're going to get us all killed. No, Tommy replied calmly. I'm going to get them killed. The more resources they dedicate to hunting one man in a kilt, the fewer they have for fighting the war. But Tommy's greatest victory was still to come. And it would involve not just one German soldier, but an entire army. The impossible negotiation. September 1944. As Allied forces advanced through France, German resistance collapsed. Isolated Wehrmacht units found themselves cut off from supply lines and facing certain defeat. It was then that Tommy received the most extraordinary request of his military career. German commanders wanted to negotiate surrender terms, not with Allied headquarters, not with French military authorities. With him. The kilted killer in his black Citroën. The message came through resistance channels from Captain Arthur Cox, another Jedburgh leader. The Germans want to talk. They specifically asked for the Highland officer. Tommy understood why. In the chaos of retreating armies and collapsed communications, he had become the most visible symbol of Allied authority in southern France. His psychological campaign had been so effective that German commanders saw him as someone with real power to negotiate. The reality was more complex. Tommy was a major in the British Army, but he had no authority to accept surrenders. What he had was something more valuable, a reputation for keeping his word. The first meeting was set for a village schoolhouse in territory controlled by neither side. The German negotiation team arrived first, 3 staff cars with officers, medical personnel, and a white flag. Tommy arrived alone in his black Citroën, flags flying as always. As he walked into the schoolhouse, wearing his complete Highland uniform, Tommy could see the effect he had on the German officers. They had expected to meet a resistance leader. Instead, they faced the living embodiment of their own fears, the Scottish phantom who had made their lives hell for months. General Botho Henning Elster, commander of the German forces, was a professional soldier from the old Prussian tradition. He studied Tommy with the calculating gaze of someone trying to solve a tactical problem. "You are the Highland officer?" Elster asked in excellent English. "Major Ronald Thomas Stuart Macpherson, British Army," Tommy replied formally. "And you, General, are in quite a predicament." The numbers were staggering. Elster commanded 23,000 German troops, a mixture of frontline combat soldiers and rear echelon personnel. They were cut off from German lines, surrounded by hostile French civilians, and facing certain destruction if they tried to fight their way out. "What terms do you offer?" Elster asked. Tommy leaned back in his chair, every inch the confident Highland officer. What he said next would determine the fate of 23,000 men. "Unconditional surrender to Allied forces," Tommy stated calmly, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that comes from complete confidence in one's position. "Your men will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Officers may retain their sidearms until they are formally processed by Allied military police. Medical personnel will be given access to treat wounded soldiers from both sides." General Elster nodded slowly, his experienced soldier's mind working through the implications of what was being offered. In the chaos of a collapsing front, with communication lines severed and supply routes cut, the terms were actually quite reasonable. But there was something about this Highland officer that bothered him, a quality of supreme confidence that seemed almost supernatural. "And if we refuse these terms?" Elster asked, his voice carefully neutral. This was the moment Tommy had been building toward for months. Everything, the Highland uniform that had made him instantly recognizable, the bold driving tours that had created a legend, the psychological warfare campaign that had turned him into a figure of myth among German forces, had been preparation for this single conversation. The fate of 23,000 men hung on what he said next. Tommy leaned back in his chair, every inch the confident Highland officer who had terrorized German forces across southern France. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, conversational, but carried undertones of absolute menace. "If you refuse, General, I will personally call in concentrated artillery strikes on your positions. We have the coordinates for every one of your strong points, every ammunition dump, every vehicle park. After the artillery preparation, I will request RAF bombing runs using the latest intelligence about your troop dispositions. And after that, if anything is still moving in your sector, the American 83rd Infantry Division will advance through your positions with overwhelming force." It was a complete bluff, and Tommy knew it. He had no authority to call in artillery strikes from units that were hundreds of miles away. He couldn't request RAF bombing runs, he wasn't even in direct communication with Allied Air Command. The 83rd Infantry Division was nowhere in the operational area, and even if they had been, a single major in the British Army had no authority to coordinate American ground operations. But General Elster didn't know any of that. All Elster knew was the legend that had preceded Tommy into that schoolhouse. For months, this Highland officer had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to appear anywhere, strike without warning, and disappear like Highland mist. He had coordinated resistance operations across hundreds of square miles of territory. He had demonstrated detailed knowledge of German troop movements and defensive positions. He had shown the kind of tactical intelligence and operational capability that suggested direct communication with Allied High Command. If Major Macpherson claimed he could bring down the wrath of the entire Allied military machine on German positions, who was General Elster to say he couldn't? "You guarantee safe treatment for my men?" Elster asked, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. "You have my word as a British officer," Tommy replied, and in that moment, Both men understood that the negotiation was essentially over. The conversation that followed lasted another 4 hours, but it was largely about details, the mechanics of surrender, the processing of prisoners, the coordination with Allied forces. The fundamental decision had been made in that moment when Tommy's psychological reputation collided with General Elster's strategic reality. When the German general finally agreed to surrender, he was turning over the largest enemy force ever captured by a single Allied officer. But more than that, he was validating the effectiveness of psychological warfare as a weapon of war every bit as powerful as tanks, artillery, or aircraft. September 16, 1944. The formal surrender ceremony took place in a field outside the village. 23,000 German soldiers laid down their weapons under the supervision of Tommy McPherson and his hastily assembled resistance fighters. The logistics were nightmarish. Tommy's army consisted of perhaps 300 French resistance fighters, armed mostly with captured German weapons. They were about to take custody of 23,000 professional soldiers, including 7,000 frontline combat troops, but Tommy's psychological warfare paid its final dividend. The German soldiers had heard so many stories about the Highland officer that they assumed he commanded vast Allied forces just out of sight. They surrendered their weapons peacefully, convinced that resistance would only bring down overwhelming retaliation. News of the surrender reached Allied headquarters within hours. A single British major, wearing a Highland kilt and driving a flag-draped Citroën, had accomplished what entire divisions struggled to achieve. The headlines were immediate and worldwide. Kilted killer captures 23,000 Germans. Scottish officer's greatest victory. The men who made Nazis afraid of kilts. But for Tommy, standing in that field surrounded by thousands of surrendering soldiers, the moment was bittersweet. Today, military academies around the world study Tommy McPherson's campaign as a masterclass in psychological warfare and unconventional tactics. At the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, the U.S. Army War College, and elite Special Forces training centers from Fort Bragg to Hereford, instructors use his techniques as examples of how individual initiative and creative thinking can achieve strategic results far beyond what conventional force structures might suggest. The techniques he pioneered during those months in occupied France, using visibility instead of concealment, building legend through audacity, turning enemy expectations against them, leveraging psychological impact over physical destruction, have become standard elements of modern special operations doctrine. Military psychologists have written extensively about the McPherson effect, the phenomenon whereby a single individual can become a force multiplier through the creation and management of their own mythology. The black Citroën with its flying flags has been recreated for military museums, and the 300,000 franc bounty poster has become one of the most sought-after pieces of World War II memorabilia. Collectors and historians prize it not just for its rarity, but for what it represents, a moment when the German war machine, which had conquered most of Europe through superior organization and military efficiency, was so frustrated by one man in a Highland kilt that they offered a fortune for his capture. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Tommy McPherson exists not in museums or military manuals, but in the collective memory of southern France. In villages throughout the Auvergne and the Dordogne, there are still elderly people who remember the summer of 1944, when a Highland officer in a black Citroën drove past their homes with flags flying in defiance of Nazi occupation. They remember the excitement that rippled through their communities when word spread that Le Touricasais had been seen in their area, the hope that his presence represented to them. He was never just the kilted killer, the figure of legend who terrorized German forces. He was something more important and more human. He was hope made visible, courage wearing Cameron tartan, proof that even in the darkest times, when the future seemed uncertain and freedom appeared lost, one determined individual could make a difference that echoed through history. The story of Tommy McPherson reminds us that warfare is not just about superior numbers or advanced technology. It is also about the human spirit, about the power of individual courage to inspire others, about the ability of creative thinking to overcome seemingly impossible odds. In an age of mass armies and technological warfare, his campaign stands as a testament to the enduring importance of the individual soldier's ingenuity, determination, and willingness to take extraordinary risks for a cause greater than himself. The Germans put a 300,000 franc bounty on Tommy McPherson because they understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that some men are worth more than money. Some men are worth fear itself. And in wartime, being feared by your enemies, not for cruelty or brutality, but for competence, audacity, and an unshakable commitment to victory, is the highest compliment a soldier can receive. His Highland kilt may have been an anachronism in the mechanized warfare of the 20th century, but it served as a reminder that the warrior spirit transcends technology, that courage is timeless, and that sometimes the greatest victories come not from hiding in the shadows, but from standing in the light, daring the world to stop you. Sleep well, and remember, sometimes the greatest victories come not from hiding in the shadows, but from standing in the light, daring the world to stop you.